Chase Carroll, Catholic, what's up? Guys, if you want to support the stream, you can do so also through Super Chats. Super Chats are done through Streamlabs. I'll give you the link. You can also do it natively through YouTube as well. What's up?
Hey, what's going on? I had a couple questions for you. Number one, I'm trying to understand. I'm a Catholic. I'm a few years into the faith. I'm vaguely becoming aware or more aware of like nature grace distinction, the like natural revelation and then supernatural revelation. What is it that Orthodox? Yeah, what is the main contention within Orthodoxy? Is it you think that? Yeah, like you think presuppositionalism is only tag argument is the only way to ground interacting with the real world, or?
Well, there's a bunch of different things you brought up there. So, no, I don't think tag is the only way to ground every single line of argumentation, but I think it's the only way to ground a paradigm level question. So, no, you don't have to use the transit argument for God to say, well, how do I know that my neighbor is Bill Cosby or Lil Wayne? You would go investigate that and you would use your sense data for that. So, no, not every argument is grounded in this, but can you mute for a second because it's really loud in the background? So
Yeah, sorry about
just
that.
1 second. And I'll read this and then you can, then we can pivot off of this because this is one of the greatest theologians of the Orthodox Church of recent years in the 20th century, Father Saint Demetrius Daniloi. And he begins his book exactly as you guys hear me talking, right? The same way that I would have critiqued Jesus and Whatnot or Tim Gordon or any other Thomist. He says the Orthodox Church does not make a separation between natural and supernatural revelation. So notice this is addressing the Thomistic position where you have this sort of division, this two-tiered system between nature and grace, between natural theology and supernatural revelation. Natural revelation in our scheme is known and understood fully in the light of divine revelation or supernatural revelation. So this is something that I think a Thomist might agree with, but I think we're going to see more radical statements as we progress that the Roman Catholic or the Thomist would find to be very difficult. Let me say, for example, when I look at the natural world in the Orthodox conception, the meaning and the referent of the natural world is Jesus. In the Thomistic scheme, that's not true. The Trinity is not the meaning and the referent of the natural world. The Trinity is in the domain of supernatural revelation. That's not the domain of nature and natural theology. And if you want a full debate on this was the whole debate that I had with Trent Horn was this question. So let's read a little bit more. He says, we might say that natural revelation is given and maintained by God continuously throughout his divine act, which is above nature. This is why St. Maximus the Confessor does not posit an essential distinction between natural revelation and supernatural or biblical. See that? So in other words, the Bible, what's the meaning of the Bible? The Logos. What's the meaning of nature? The sticks and the trees? Also the Logos. Right? This is the part that's, I think, very contentious. Now, a Thomist, and this is what I argued with Tim for hours yesterday, they're going to say, look, I agree the natural world is ultimately, quote, grounded in God metaphysically. So we agree there. But here's the point of difference. They don't believe that epistemology is ultimately grounded in the Trinity, or that the direct epistemic, the knowledge meaning of nature and sticks and trees is Jesus or the Trinity, you see. So they'll play this game where they'll be like, oh, look, we agree with you. Ontologically, all of reality is grounded in the Trinity. That's not what you're saying about the meaning and the epistemic grounding in divine revelation. You do not believe that. That is not a Thomistic teaching. So again, to hammer this home, this is why this is such a different way of thinking. This book right here is a created object, and it has as its referent and its meaning the Logos, right? We all agree with that, I think, unless you're like an independent fundamentalist Baptist and you think this is an uncreated eternal book, which makes you a polytheist. But all of us, I think, would agree that, of course, the book's meaning and referent is Jesus. Yes. Here's the point of departure. We are also saying that the sticks and the trees meaning is Jesus. The difference is they're two mediums of that revelation. One is sticks and trees, and one is a created book with words. They're both referring to the same Logos, the same Jesus. And that is what the Thomists cannot say. They do not believe that. That is why. This isn't even contentious. Let me read a little bit more and I'll let you speak. He says, according to Maximus, the latter is only embodying the former in historical persons and actions. So in other words, the Bible is informing or encoding, inscriptionizing, just to use the language of JP Uncut, the same logos that nature is inscripturizing. The affirmation of Maximus must be taken in the sense that these two are not divorced. They're not two separate domains. They're the same domain in terms of reference. Supernatural revelation unfolds and brings forth its fruit within the framework of natural revelation, like a casting of the work of God into bolder relief, guiding the physical and historical world towards the goal for which it was created in accordance with the plan laid down for the ages. Supernatural revelation merely restores the direction and provides a more determined support for that inner movement maintained within the world by God through natural revelation. So Jesus is the meaning behind the sticks and the trees, and Jesus is the meaning behind the book, and they're both pointing to the same telos, the same end goal Jesus. They're just two different ways of referring to the same thing. See? That's not Thomism. It's different. At the beginning, in the state of the world, before the fall, when everything was, quote, fully normal, natural revelation was not separated from revelation that was supernature. Consequently, supernatural revelation places natural revelation itself in a clearer light. So, in other words, the Bible is my first starting point. Divine revelation, I'm not being sola scriptura, I'm just saying divine revelation in scripture and tradition is actually the starting point for how I interpret the natural world. That is the opposite starting point of a Thomist for interpreting the natural world. Again, we go back to death. For Thomists, as Aquinas explicitly says, death is natural. No. For Orthodox, death is unnatural because it is a result of the fall. There's nothing natural about death at all. It's unnatural. It is the enemy, Paul says. So, even with some concept like death, if I don't begin my interpretation of the natural world with divine revelation and the fall, then I'm going to come to faulty conclusions. I'm going to conclude that, well, predator-prey relationships, death, that's part of nature. It must be natural. It's good. And we're saying, no, ultimately, those are not the original state. Death is not natural. But I'm only going to be able to interpret the natural world correctly if I believe in the fall. And it should be obvious if you're a Christian, you have to have that there. Well, then there's no such thing as a starting point of interpreting the natural world that excludes the fall, obviously. And if that's true, then all of Thomism fails. Like it's faulty right there. That alone shows you that Thomism fails. How can you interpret the natural world without divine revelation when it includes the doctrine of the fall as necessary to understand it? Because if the fall didn't happen, I'm going to think that corruption, decay, and death are part of that order. They're not. The Bible says how many times over? God did not will death. Death is unnatural. Death is the enemy. Death will be destroyed at the eschaton. Why would it be destroyed if it's natural? This is so stupid. Chase, go ahead.
Just trying to understand. I'm going to try and restate it and tell me if I'm understanding it correctly. Well, I'm going to give my understanding of it. So the Thomist, well, I don't know if this is universally within all the different Catholic schools. I don't know if Scotus, you were Catholic for a good time, so you might know this better than me. If like Scotus or any of the different theological schools, like the Jesuit schools, around things any differently?
No, every Roman Catholic has to believe in natural theology. It would be against basic Roman Catholic dogma to deny natural theology.
Well, not to be fact checky, but where did that?
Just off the top of my head, Vatican I says that explicitly at the beginning.
When it says there's a credibility, we can know, or it gives like natural revelation.
Not natural revelation, natural theology. So it's stated in Vatican I. John Paul II has a famous encyclical called Fides et Ratio, and he defines what Catholic natural theology is in that as an example. And by the way, I could get the Evangelical Dictionary of Theology on the shelf over there. It has the exact same definition. So basically between Protestants and Roman Catholics who believe in the natural theology tradition and what's called classical theism, there's not, as far as I'm aware, any significant difference on what, quote, natural theology is. Natural theology is defined as reasoning about God apart from divine revelation.
And then the other thing was, so I think this is what we believe as Catholics, please correct me if I'm wrong, but that Adam and Eve, the original state was a supernatural state. When we say death wasn't original, but it is a part of nature if nature was not constituted in a supernatural gift. right?
I'm not trying to be difficult. I don't know what any of that means, because Paul says in Romans 8 that all death is a result of the fall. So when Adam sinned is when death came into our universe and our world. Yes, technically Satan had sinned in the realm of the angels, but that's not identical to our world or our domain. The church fathers say that that occurred in the aeon, the timeless created eternity. And then Satan was allowed to tempt man in the garden, and then death in every sense, according to Romans 8, entered when Adam sinned. So for us, because Adam was situated as the representative or the figurehead or the high priest of all the created order, when Adam sinned, he brought death, decay, entropy, corruption to the entire universe. The entire metaphysics of the universe altered in the fall. And that's a very different conception of the Roman Catholic idea of the donum superaddendum.
I'm sorry, what was the last?
The Roman Catholic idea of the superadded grace. This is a donum superaddendum in the Garden of Eden. We don't have it. We don't have any of that.
Would that mean, though, that every Orthodox would have to affirm, not necessarily young earth, but absolute no death before the fall?
So there's two arguments that I make, and that doesn't mean they're going to, but I make two arguments on this line of reasoning. First of all, the Sixth Ecumenical Council has in its canons, you cannot affirm that death occurred before the fall. And so if you say that death is natural or that death occurred before Adam, it says that you are excommunicated. The Sixth Ecumenical Council also affirms the teaching of Saint Sophronius of Jerusalem. It affirms his confession, and the confession of Saint Sophronius has a 4-page condemnation of the entire system of origin, which includes ahistoricizing the ahistorical account of Genesis. So, for example, in the confession of Saint Sophronius, there's this long discussion, 4 pages of it. That's long for a council confession, but confession that you can't believe that Adam and Eve were ahistorical. You can't believe that Genesis was not real. There might be some flexibility on the exact date of the earth, so I'm not trying to be super dogmatic about that. But if you watch, for example, Jim Bob's debate, not that you did, but there was a really interesting discussion that Jim Bob had with an evangelical dude that was defending theistic evolution. And even though the guy was evangelical, he was still trying really hard to make it mesh with the scriptures. And I think Jim Bob did really good bringing forth a lot of really bizarre sorts of things you would have to affirm. So, for example, if you believe that theistic evolution is the case and that death occurred before the fall, it's not actually God creating the animals, because really the only thing God creates, ex nihilo creation, which scripture is pretty clear about ex nihilo creation many times over, it's actually just the first, protoplasm or the first amoeba, because everything else is actually the product of death, right? You have millions of aeons of death that actually is what produces Adam and Eve. It's not a direct creation by God ex nihilo. So you're already in these weird sorts of, well, God didn't create them because he created them by this process of death. Now you're going to say, well, but what about the fact that we come to be now through a process of biological generation? Yeah, but that's not what we're talking about before the fall. Okay. So you can't make the perfect analogy to, well, it's no different than it is now. Again, it is different because life before the fall, in our view, is radically different. And that's why Romans 8 says, when Adam sinned, all death, decay, and corruption came into the world. That's the whole argument Paul's making, because he says all of creation was subjected to vanity or death, is what he's talking about, decay, corruption. He says, for we know now that all of creation groans and travails in pain, right? Waiting for the deliverance from this vanity. All of creation, he says, was made subject to death, to vanity, to decay, to corruption, because Christ subjected it to that in the hope that all of creation itself will be delivered from the bondage of corruption. Obviously, he's talking about the fall. And so, in other words, the cosmic scope of the incarnation is just as cosmic as the scope of Adam's fall. And if you restrict Adam's fall to only affecting humans, then you've removed the cosmic recapitulation scope of Christ's resurrection and glorification. Are you familiar with recapitulation? Are you there, Chase? I can't hear you cutting out.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, I am not. Could you define recapitulation?
Right. So if you read, for example, Irenaeus or many of the earliest church fathers, they will look at 1 Corinthians 15 and they'll say, look, Jesus is assuming all of human nature, universal human nature. And in fact, according to passages like Romans 8, the resurrection and the ascension, the transfiguration, they don't just transform man, they transform the entire cosmos. And so this is why St. Maximus, for example, is famous for emphasizing the cosmic scope of Christ's resurrection. So the whole universe is recreated and redone, right? In Thomism and Roman Catholicism, they do not have a conception of the cosmic scope, even though at Vatican II, Hans Urs von Balthasar tried to make this popular again. I don't think he did. And by the way, if he had to make something fundamental to Christology popular again, then that means that Rome lost the basics of Christology for 1,000 years. So it's fundamental to Orthodox Christology that Christ assumes universal human nature and then also resurrects and transfigures the entire cosmos. And if you've lost that, you've lost basics of the incarnation, dude.
I'm not saying this is like paradigm defeater or anything, but I'm more asking in like practicality.
Sure.
Wouldn't you're saying like every Orthodox priest or maybe bishop or even patriarchate right now would maybe affirm the theology you're saying? No, it isn't.
No, they would. Absolutely. I've never seen an Orthodox bishop or person who would deny the cosmic scope of Christ's redemption. This isn't controversial.
I'm sorry, I meant like that there was no death before the fall. Isn't that kind of a...
Well, it doesn't matter if this or that bishop doesn't, because in the Orthodox Church, the higher authority is the ecumenical council. So if the ecumenical council affirms that, that's higher than any specific bishop. So what is that? That'd be saying, well, this or that Roman Catholic bishop doesn't affirm XYZ. So yeah, but so what? I mean,
the reason I was asking it up or bringing it up was critique that if Hans Balthasar had to renew that teaching, even though it was still dogmatic, and he just had to bring it back into the forefront of both minds. I was just trying to...
Yeah, I can see it, but here's the thing. Again, to Orthodox theology, it's unthinkable that if Rome preserves the true faith, they would lose something essential and fundamental to the incarnation and its scope.
But it's not in the Orthodox paradigm, or the Orthodox paradigm allows for maybe...
No, we have a giant ceremony every year called the Harrowing of Hades that proves this point. You guys don't even do that.
We do affirm... I'm not aware of a celebration.
What I'm saying is I get that you might verbally affirm, but if you've lost the significance for the purpose of these actions, then you've lost something essential to Christ's death, burial, and resurrection and ascension. The cosmic scope of it is essential. There's no church fathers, especially the council fathers, that would deny this type of a position. It's fundamental to the Christology of the seven councils. And then to say that, well, Rome might not have remembered this for 700 or 800 years, but this guy who's a universalist at Vatican just happens to bring it back. Why would you have to bring back something that if you guys are the preservers of the faith? How would you lose this?
I was just curious how it fit into the paradigm, because I'm not super educated on that stream of theology throughout the scholastic time period, if that got neglected. But you're saying that got neglected even in the Scotus school, and then
they don't talk about this. We're not interested in questions of Eastern theology. They don't talk about the harrowing of Hades. They don't talk about the cosmic scope of Christ's redemption. It's something that's only in Eastern Orthodox theology, consistently and with relevance.
Is it affirmed in Oriental and Coptic traditions as well, or is it? I mean, I know they have their own issues, but I'm just curious.
Their theology is fairly open. They don't really. I don't know how significant it is in their theology. They would affirm the harrowing of Hades, but the essence energy distinction theology they are not very clear on that. But I think that they would tend to probably agree with us. The tendency would probably be the same.
And then also the practicality. So this is a...
By the way, I found the canon, by the way. This is the Sixth Ecumenical Council.
Let me write it down.
You have to do a little searching because this doesn't always come up. You have to look a little bit.
Can I find it in like the AAS or whatever, Acts of the Apostolic?
No, that's papal acts. This is the Sixth Ecumenical Council, and it's canon. It's right here. Was it 109?
Sorry, that was retarded.
It's okay. That's papal acts. This is the canons of the Ecumenical Council. This is the Sixth Ecumenical Council, canon 109, and it says, Adam was not created subject to death. Whoever says that Adam, the first man, was created mortal, so that whether he had sinned or not, he would have died. That is, he would have gone forth from his body, not because of the sins, but by a natural necessity, let him be anathema. So you can't say that death existed before the fall or that death is natural.
Wait, can you repeat that again? Doesn't that say just that Adam wasn't? Because, or what is the can?
Bro,
you
if
just
theistic evolution is true, then Adam would have been subject to death. He would have been the product of millions of years of death.
I'm not even necessarily saying like theistic evolution. I'm saying I don't know how familiar you are with there's a dude that just wrote the story of the movie, like, Story of Creation or Story of Everything.
I don't know.
He was on Python. Anyway, point is micro or every micro adaptation, I think is what it is.
Dude, to say that there's death before the fall would be to deny that Romans 8 is equating Adam's scope to Christ's scope. You understand that that's the point here. The point is that it messes up Christology.
And this isn't like really anal, but so does that mean could there be plant death before the fall?
No, I'm saying there's no death because Romans 8 is arguing that all of creation was subjected to vanity, futility, and corruption due to Adam's sin, because Adam is the steward and the head of the created order. He was the prophet, priest, and king of creation, right? And so when he failed, a new prophet, priest, and king of creation has to come. That's the second Adam. And if you read 1 Corinthians 15, Paul makes the scope of Adam's fall the same as the scope of Christ's recapitulation. So Adam's scope, according to Romans 8, is all Pluto has entropy because of Adam's fall. That's what we're saying. I don't know that Aquinas thought about that or not. I don't know what his position on Pluto would be. I'm just saying it's a universal cosmic scope, and I don't think the Roman Catholic tradition maintained the significance of that universal scope. So that's what I'm saying.
And then, so what do you think, like, Adam and Eve ate? I don't know if that's a stupid question, but...
So again, if you read, for example, First Created Man by St. Simeon the New Theologian, which is a little book that's very easily and accessible, or if you read...
First Created Man?
By St. Simeon the New Theologian. It's a little book about creation from the Orthodox perspective. Or if you read, which is back in print now, Father Seraphim Rose's book, Genesis, Creation, Early Man, he spends a good amount of time arguing from the Church Fathers and from Scripture that the metaphysics of the world was very different. So we didn't have a biological sort of digestive incisor type makeup before the fall. We had some form of body that was a deified spiritual body, the same type of a body that Paul talks about in Corinthians and in Romans, that in the resurrection we will have a body like that. So it was like when Christ is resurrected, right? He walks through walls and he can appear and disappear. So he's not bound by time and space, even though he still has a, quote, physical body. So in the same way, in Eden, the metaphysics of how they lived and operated is very different from what we have now. And if you read the Church Fathers, when they talk about the fall, it says God killed an animal and made them skins. Right? A lot of Church Fathers think that that's our body, right? So that's why we have an animal component to us, is because we were given skins like the other animals have. But again, this is after the fall. We don't exactly know the makeup and the metaphysics of how we operated before the fall, but we didn't have biological needs to eat food. So we wouldn't even be needing to eat. If eating occurred, it could have occurred in some way that we didn't understand. Even St. Augustine says eating in the garden was probably some noetic way.
That also makes sense of a lot of models of evolution input the assumption that half-lives or whatever, or things we like view in biology, it's assuming that those things have been in perpetuity going back for a long time, but obviously...
We would say that no, we don't know that.
And this was my last question. Eric Ibarra has said this about the peasant argument for the papacy.
What?
The peasant argument for the papacy, so I'll try to explain it briefly.
Sure.
But so we've talked, obviously, pretty... For the average person, for your grandma or a peasant in the medieval ages, pretty dense level theology probably on this conversation. And that, not as an absolute necessity, but as a moral necessity for the average person, for like the grandma, for the, I don't know, that's the peasant, for them to be able to very clearly and visibly know what the true faith is. Bishop of Rome, like singular visible sign of unity, is not an absolute necessity, but a moral necessity. And I thought it was a pretty good argument. The same way there was a singular head visible sign of unity in like the Old Covenant with the high priest. I was just curious, your thoughts on that. I'm not saying it's like, once again, it's not a paradigm defeater because it's not an absolute necessity, but it is, the point is that it's a moral necessity, so that instead of having, if you had to expect everyone to be able to argue the material of theology to the point where they were able to affirm or disagree with high-level Christology, people wouldn't really be able to come to the true faith. They wouldn't know when I'm misunderstanding it. You know what I mean? Like if they're not coming to the right conclusion, there's not a clear way of submitting to an authority. if it's all about the material of it rather than the form being limiting to the bishop of Rome.
All right, so a couple things popped into my head. So let's go back to the time of Abraham. Was there a high priest at that time?
No.
Was there
A type of it or
well, Abraham ties to Melchizedek.
Oh, okay. Melchizedek, would Melchizedek have been the high priest at the time?
Well, what I'm saying is, if you're going to make the analogy to you needed to have a single head, would it be Abraham or Melchizedek at that time that's the authority that unifies?
I think the critique, I get that. I think the critique of that would be that, like,
these are
the Mosaic.
Hold on, they're more, but these are more peasanted people because this is the ancient world. So a more brutal world, less of an IQ than the Middle Ages, we'll say for the sake of argument. So if we're going to make a moral argument that God is bound to give and provide a simple way for the peasants, the plebs, to find unity and to find the true faith, who and where was that at the time of Abraham and Melchizedek?
I guess it was communion with Abraham or biological descent.
Oh wait, so it's a communion of the people?
Yeah, but
how is that the same? But no, the argument is there's a single visible head, and that's the pleb way for the simpletons to see the true faith. That's the Ibarra argument. I remember this now because I remember Ibarra making this argument now.
Would it be that you have to be a descendant, but also you have to be in communion with the patriarch, so Abraham?
You're missing the point. If the argument is God must provide a single visible head for the plebs, who is the single visible head that's the moral proof for the plebs in the days of Abraham and Melchizedek?
Why would saying Abraham, why is that? I'm not understanding.
Well, why would it not be Melchizedek? Because Melchizedek is the high priest that Abraham submits to.
Would it be the way the Pope submits to Christ? It's not a divorced or either or thing. It's like a both and.
If you were going to point to the Mosaic time and say that the Mosaic administration had a high, then why would the high priest in that situation not also refer to Christ? Well, then it doesn't refer to the Pope. Or who between Melchizedek and Abraham would be the Pope figure? Abraham is said to be father of all nations. So wouldn't it be Abraham? But Abraham's not a high priest. And if you wanted to use the Mosaic analogy, you're going to say the high priest is the unifying single figure. So again, that's why this argument doesn't work. And I'm going to give you another argument on top of this as to why it doesn't work, which is the Great Western Schism. So if you want to go ahead and answer from the Abraham period, feel free. Who's this single unifying figure for the plebs?
I'm sorry, what's plebs mean?
The dirt farmers.
But communion, why is it that there's no, I guess, distinction? If you're in communion with Abraham, would you not be in communion by...
The question was not communion. Again, the question is, who is the public single visible figure that provides the pleb the easy way to know the true faith?
I guess principally Melchizedek and then secondarily Abraham?
Well, I thought the argument was we need one head. So now you're making the argument there's two heads of the church.
Well, I'm just thinking of it the same way. Christ is obviously the head of the church, but then the Pope is, we can also refer to him like the Father.
So who's Jesus here? Melchizedek is Jesus, and then Abraham is the Pope. This just gets ridiculous. Sorry, so fine, let's forget that. In the Great Western Schism, when there's three popes, what's the simple, visible, moral proof for the peasants? So this is a 40-year split. We don't know who the Pope is, and an ecumenical council, by the way, is what solves this, not a Pope. So who are the plebs supposed to look to?
I do not know. I'm trying to.
All right, so that's why I don't buy it. These are two examples as to where I think Ibarra's argument is just arbitrary. It doesn't work. Because if you're going to say that God was always morally bound to do this, which is what I thought that's what you're saying, right? There's sort of a moral obligation that God has to provide for the peasants a simple, easy, visible sign of unity in a single earthly head.
I don't know. I don't know if obligation is the right word. I don't think God's like obligated to do. I think moral necessity meaning. Yeah, it's honestly a good question. I might have just spoken.
Well, what immoral necessity? What does that mean? Yeah. What do you mean by? What do you think he means by moral necessity in that argument?
I don't know. I thought it was just that it's not metaphysically or absolutely necessary, but if God desires that a simple man can know the truth, and that obedience is not rocket science for a farmer, that the farmer can have a simple discipleship means. I want to be a disciple. I don't have to get into deep metaphysics. I know the visible sign of who to follow.
Let's transfer this because I like this experiment. Let's say for the sake of argument, we are going to go to the high priest of the Mosaic time. In Israel, Israel, by the way, is a type of, obviously, of the church. why is it that I'm supposed to think that the high priest is a type of the Pope in this line of argumentation? Isn't there also a king? So Solomon, for example, he's the Shalom, he's the king of peace. He reigns during a time of peace. He builds the temple. Why isn't Solomon a type of the Pope, or is he?
It can be both, right? Like we believe that there's certain types of
So,
Mary.
I agree with that. But wait a minute. The argument was we need a single visible head. The Pope is like the high priest. And I'm saying Israel doesn't have a single visible head. Israel has a king and a priest, and those two spheres are distinct in the history of Israel. In fact, Saul, for example, is castigated for engaging in priestly activities, right? Samuel rebukes him for trying to sacrifice at the altar when that's not what the king's supposed to do. So I'm just wondering, on this line of argumentation, well, if Israel has two heads, namely a high priest head and a king as the head, why am I supposed to think that, oh, well, the papacy is obviously just proven by the high priest? And if you admit that he's not, then you're admitting, in my argument is, you're admitting that there's two heads of Israel. So I don't understand why this, in other words, this argument disproves the idea that there is a single head fulfillment that proves some sort of peasant sign of what the true church is.
Oh, I'm actually curious. So who do you think communion was? Who was an Israelite bound to, in principle, to communion to first, the king or the high priest?
Well, it doesn't matter. I'm just saying if Israel has two heads, one spiritual, one temporal, they're both in a sense spiritual, but one focuses on the spiritual. Why would I think that there's one head? Because remember, Roman Catholics argue that the church, Israel is a type of the church. So what is the king pointing to in the fulfillment? Is that if that's also the Pope, then you're admitting that in the Old Testament period, there's two heads of Israel. If there's two heads of Israel that God has ordained as a sign of unity, then that undercuts the argument of a single earthly visible head. That's the point. Because God basically has two heads for this whole time period of the Mosaic Law.
But who were they? I'm curious now. So even if I am wrong, I'm curious to what you do with that same information. So who were they? Is this a good question? Who were they principally bound to first, the king or the high priest? In your paradigm, does that make sense? Does my question make sense? Like, even if I am wrong,
I just don't even think this argument necessarily works. That if you just find a single dude, that somehow proves that God is giving the plebs an easy moral sign of what the church is. Because, for example, if this was true, then I would assume that when there's disputes in the early church, so like the first 4 or 5 centuries of the church, wouldn't the same line of argumentation been used? So, for example, let's say it's the year 300, and I'm sure you would admit prior to Nicaea, right? There were disputes in the church, right?
yes, yeah.
So would all of those disputes be necessarily resolved by Rome, churches that are thousands of miles away?
No.
So if I'm a new convert, I'm a Roman centurion and I live in Corinth or Ephesus or something in the year 300, and I start hearing this message about Jesus, is it necessary for me to learn about what's happening in the Roman See to know what the true church is?
No.
Thank you. Then that right there is all that's needed to show that none of this other stuff is actually necessary for what Ibarra's trying to do.
But now I think it might still be. Tell me if this is wrong, but because we would still distinguish between formal versus material heresy. So like, if you were unaware of it,
well, what does that have to do with? What does this have to do with the Roman centurion, a person converting in the year 300? So it's the year 300. I don't have access to Rome. There's not been any ecumenical councils, so I don't know what the faith is because I'm not interacting with and learning about the Roman See.
Well, so in your paradigm, what does salvific communion look like for that person?
I'm just simply saying, all I'm trying to argue is that a single visible earthly head is not necessary from these examples to know the true faith, even for the plebs.
Okay, I guess my return question is, if that's been the paradigm I operate under, so if that's not true, then what does communion look like for the pleb? How do they?
I'm simply saying that they can directly find out and learn and know what the true church is via the work of the Holy Spirit, and has nothing to do necessarily with the Roman See. Now, the Roman See at that period is Orthodox. I'm not disagreeing or rejecting it. I'm saying it is Orthodox, but they don't even have to know about the Roman See to become a Christian in the year 300 in Ephesus.
Yes, but do you think they had to know if they held material, say, Trinitarian heresy before Nicaea? Is that person unable to be saved before clarification of doctrine at Nicaea?
I think that God deals with people mercifully. I don't think the Orthodox spirit or mindset, we have the tendency to we wouldn't just damn somebody for simply making a mistake. Again, we have the position. I think we would agree with the material formal idea. We would agree that to be a heretic is not merely just to be wrong, but it's to consistently oppose church correction in obstinacy for a period of time. So, for example, Origen is a heretic because he explicitly went against the saints of his day, calling him out, and the church calling him out in his day. That's documented too, by the way. But he's not a heretic because he didn't oppose the church. And in fact, he offered his writings up, as he says on the Trinity Book 3, to be corrected by the universal church. So one is a heretic because of his obstinacy. The other is not a heretic because of his humility.
I think that same thing would apply then. That's what I mean when I say a person before Nicaea.
That's what I'm saying.
Not know about the Bishop of Rome, but he wouldn't be a formal heretic. That doesn't mean that
No, that's a different question, because the question of heresy has to do with specific error. I'm talking about just plain ignorance. We would admit that a person can be saved in the year 300. Obviously, you have to admit this, or else you're led to absurd conclusions without knowledge of what's going on in Rome or the Roman See. That's different from a person who's explicitly affirming and teaching something erroneous.
I think I would say that I think the Catholic position would be that if someone was aware of the Roman See and was formally opposing the Roman,
I didn't bring that up. That's not an example I brought up, so it's not relevant to what we're arguing.
I'm just clarifying my.
Let me put it this way: it's the year 300. I'm a Roman centurion. I just learned about Christianity. I go to the Church of Ephesus, which has apostolic succession from Paul to Timothy. Everybody admits this, and I learn some proto-creed that's equivalent of what will become the Nicene Creed. Let's say for the sake of argument, right? Neither the Nicene Creed nor the eventual Nicene Creed has anything to do with Peter or Rome. It doesn't say anything about it. Have I not learned the Christian faith because I didn't learn about the See of Rome or Peter or anything like that?
No, but I would say in the same way, in your view, since energy's distinction would be if you formally denied that, that'd be heresy. Even if the person...
It doesn't... Again, you're confusing ignorance with explicit error. I haven't committed any errors. I haven't taught against anything. The guy in this example doesn't know about the See of Rome, and we're admitting that. Look, let's just forget any errors. Let's just say I convert in the year 300 to the church in Ephesus, and I never teach any errors for the sake of argument. Did I not know the faith because I didn't hear about Rome?
No, I was in the same way that if you didn't know about in your paradigm, if you didn't know about the essence energies distinction, that doesn't mean you don't know the true faith. You're just ignorant to it.
You're missing the point of this analogy. The point of this analogy is not, did you learn every possible dogma? The point is it possible to come to the faith without Rome and without knowing about the papacy? Is that possible?
Yes.
Then the papacy is not necessary to know the faith. That's all I'm trying to argue, and that's the whole point. That's the Orthodox point. The papacy is not needed. That refutes all the Ibarra stuff earlier.
But I guess the distinction about that is everyone was in communion.
No, they weren't. But it doesn't even matter if all the other churches are communion. If I can know and learn what the faith is without any access to Rome in the year 300, then the papacy is simply not necessary. That's all I need to prove it's not necessary. But if it's not necessary, then it refutes Ibarra's point.
But there hadn't been an ecumenical council yet.
So that's why I picked before 325. That's even stronger argument for my case because there's not even an ecumenical council to point to. By the way, the ecumenical council doesn't, Nicaea's original creed doesn't say anything about Rome. Why would they have not put Rome in there or in the Niceno-Constantinopolitan Creed?
Same way there were ecumenical councils later that clarified other doctrines. That doesn't necessarily mean that those doctrines are somehow less important.
So they didn't believe at Nicaea that Rome was the cornerstone of the faith? Wouldn't they have put that in the creed?
Would you say at Nicaea they didn't believe in the energies essence distinction?
No, I'm not arguing. That's my paradigm, what I think. I don't have a problem saying that not every doctrine is in the creed. I'm saying that in the Roman Catholic scheme, if you believe that the Roman See is the one Holy Catholic Apostolic Church, why doesn't the Niceno-Constantinopolitan Creed specify Rome?
I guess my point is I don't see how that doesn't cut both ways, because essential doctrines of the faith that are not included in the creeds in your paradigm as well, just because it's not included in the creed doesn't mean it's not an essential part of the faith, especially in light of the fact that it got clarified later.
But you're missing the point, because the creed is what you're teaching so that people know the church is teaching, right?
Yes.
And if the creed is going to identify specifically the church, it's going to tell you where it is. One Holy Catholic Apostolic, right?
Yes.
Why would it not say that that's identified by Peter when that's the perfect place to say it? And if you're going to say that, well, they didn't specify every single potential doctrine, usually the doctrines, right? I agree with you. I see as focused obviously on the deity of Christ. But it seems like if it was true at the time of Nicaea that the Vatican I view was true, it seems like it would have been specified in the creed under One Holy Catholic Apostolic. Now, you could say, well, they didn't deem it necessary because they didn't deem essence energy necessary. But why would it not be deemed necessary if that's what your church teaches is the way to identify the church? I don't think that essence energy is a necessary doctrine, that I have to state that to identify the church, right? But you believe that to identify the church, you do have to state that. So why would they not?
I guess I would think that it was probably taught orally, right? I don't think that's like hope. I think that makes sense that it would have been passed on orally the same way the 6th or 7th Ecumenical Council's teaching on icon veneration was not explicitly put into the creed, but we would say was passed on orally by the Christians. So I would say that there still was necessary assent to that doctrine. It just wasn't codified.
Was it true when Constantinople I happened out of communion with Rome?
Is that, what's his face, Honorius?
No, that's the 6th Ecumenical Council. I'm talking about when you had the Meletian Schism. So St. Mellitus of Antioch calls for the Second Ecumenical Council, which is Constantinople I. And at Constantinople I, they passed the canon that says that this is the first time they pass it or they propose it. They say that the Constantinople is New Rome, and so it's second to Old Rome, right? So this is the first time, for example, we have what will be Canon 28 of Chalcedon, that the EP is the second patriarch after Rome. But St. Meletius is out of communion with Rome when this happens, and he dies out of communion with Rome. And if you look at Basil's letters, Basil writes about this period of the Meletian Schism when Constantinople I happens, and he says Rome is worthless, Rome is not helping and doesn't do anything good for the cause of the church. So what I'm asking is, if in your mind, this is where you get the addition to the creed, One Holy Catholic Apostolic. So in your mind, even though they're out of communion with Rome, Basil is saying that Rome is worthless. You think that One Holy Catholic Apostolic orally means the Roman See?
I'm sorry. I'm trying to. That was like, I'm not that educated on
That's okay.
and stuff that was going on with it. So I was just trying to process.
So let's rewind. So basically, the First Ecumenical Council, right? You get a Nicene Creed that's truncated. And then the Second Ecumenical Council is called out of communion with Rome. And we can go to Basil's letters where he talks about how worthless Rome is during this period. So, for example, in letter 66, he says, Rome is worthless. He says Antioch is the head of all the churches. He asks in the next letter, Rome to correct the unruly. He says Rome has failed because we've asked for help. They don't do anything. Rome failed. They're ignorant. And so Basil's letters that I'm referencing, we did a whole podcast, by the way, on this section of Basil's letters. He's writing these letters to Athanasius too, by the way. He's saying that, help me in Alexandria. I've appealed to Rome. They're worthless. Can you in Alexandria help us? We have this schism going on, and it's called the Meletian Schism. And so St. Mellitus is the presiding bishop of Constantinople I. Follow me so far?
Yes.
So this council happens out of communion with Rome. Hold on, I pulled up the wrong dude here. I'm trying to pull it up.
It's all good.
This keeps pulling up the militia. No, not the militia schism.
Malicious isn't bad?
No, it's pulling up the, like, militia groups. Like militia, yeah. So Mellitus of Antioch, right, was backed by some of the bishops, and there was this dispute over this guy named Paulinus. Anyway, the point is that when Meletius is presiding at Constantinople I, he is out of communion with Rome. So the point is that the presiding bishop of Rome is out of communion with Rome at this time. And in order to try to solve this schism with Mellitus, Basil is writing to other bishops to try to solve this problem, right? And he's saying Rome is worthless, and we can pull up those letters here in a second where he says that.
Wait, real quick. Can I ask a quick clarifying question?
Sure.
So Meletius is the patriarch of Constantinople?
No, the bishop of Antioch.
Okay, Antioch, and he's the presiding bishop of the council.
Constantinople I, which is the second council, right? And so
so he's out of and I'm just trying to clarify.
He is out of with Rome.
Like formally, how do you know? I just don't know. I'm ignorant. So how do you know he's out of communion with Rome? Has it been like?
This is admitted, but it's also the subject of what is part of these letters, right? So the letters of Basil that we're talking about here is this time period, and Basil's writing to he says, I've already written to Rome, so he's writing to Athanasius, and he's saying, can you help us, because this is getting to be a nightmare. But this council is still happening as Meletius is not in communion with Rome. So Constantinople I is happening as he's presiding over it. And what I'm saying is, so you have Basil saying Rome is worthless in these letters and ignorant and they're no help. And then you've got Meletius presiding over the council that adds to the original Nicene Creed one holy Catholic apostolic. So what I'm getting at is, if your argument is that they had an oral tradition that Rome is the real meaning of one holy Catholic and apostolic, how would that be the case if this is had out of communion with Rome and Basil is basically writing that Rome is worthless throughout this time period?
I guess it would be the same way if someone were to say like Honorius. So his debate about, like, I'm not even trying to get into that, but if he was a heretic or if he was just completely negligent.
Well, 3 ecumenical councils say that Honorius was a heretic, so.
Or I guess I'll just bring it
because it's not just
like,
the 6th. He's restated to be a heretic at the 7th as well.
Separate, but I don't want to. I'm not trying to like knock it down. I just want to make this point real quick, and then I'd love to hear more about that. But the same way, like Bishop, I feel like today could say that Rome is being under Francis or whatever, say Bishop or presiding bishop. It's different now because the church is just so grand, and the Bishop of Rome is never going to not be at a council, but digital travel and stuff. But say Bishop saying Rome's worthless, and the fact that what are you doing with the church?
I got you what you're saying, but that's a false analogy because this is 17 centuries after these events, and you've already had Vatican I. So that comes with the assumption that the Roman bishop that you're talking about, or the Catholic bishop that you're talking about, criticizing the Pope, he still has to formally accept Vatican I. But the difference is that you were saying that there's an oral tradition, perhaps at this time, that Rome is the real meaning of one holy Catholic apostolic. And I'm saying, well, here's counter evidence to that idea when there's been no Vatican I. So if you're going to say where is the oral tradition in Basil that Rome has this status, if he's saying Rome is worthless to resolve these schisms and these disputes, and if he's saying, and if Meletius is having the council, and by the way, it's not until later on that Constantinople I is eventually accepted by Rome. This tells me that they're holding this council and confirming it out of, they don't care what Rome says. They do it anyway. So that tells me that they're not meaning that one holy Catholic apostolic is Rome, because the actions and the teachings that I do have evidence for counteract the claim that there's oral tradition that they actually believed it was Rome.
But so go pre-Vatican I, because I don't want to be like, assume I'm making this point in the year 1700 or whatever, and a bishop or a group of bishops were to write, the Bishop of Rome is useless in the fact that during the Protestant Reformation.
But you made that, again, you made the argument that they have that view here. So I could be more strict and say, where do you get the idea that Basil has a belief that there's an oral tradition that Rome is the real meaning of one holy Catholic apostolic? Where is that in Basil? Now, you're going to say it's oral in the sense that it's never recorded. It's just an idea that they pass on. Because you said it was like icons, right? Because they're, well, but the icons do have actual argumentation in the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd century. So it's not purely oral. So you can't make the analogy to the 7th Ecumenical Council with iconographic tradition being only oral, because number one, there's actual icons in the churches. So it's not just oral. There's church fathers that talk about it. So it's not just oral.
Well, I definitely wasn't trying to say it was just oral. I was just saying, you asked why it wasn't codified.
So where's Basil? Where's the evidence that Basil thinks that Rome is the essence of one holy Catholic apostolic?
Well, if the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence.
That's why I gave you actual counter evidence that Basil says Rome is worthless and doesn't resolve schisms. So that would be against the claim that he actually thinks that they do solve schisms and that he's a papist.
I would say that I'm saying if that was isolated, but I'm saying I don't see why that can't be.
This is an ecumenical council. It's not isolated. It's the second ecumenical council.
I'm saying that quote. I'm saying like that. Not saying like you're quote farming, but I'm saying like if that one quote of the council. Well, it wasn't a canon. That was a letter to Athanasius, so that wasn't a canon of a council, though, right?
It doesn't matter. No, it's Basil's letters describing this whole time period. And he's saying that Rome is worthless. And I'm saying that, well, then he doesn't have the papal mindset. He doesn't have a Vatican I mindset. So he doesn't have the idea that there's an oral tradition that Rome is the one Holy Catholic Apostolic Church.
But, and I guess my counter,
because they're not solving this. Look, again, you're missing the point. He's complaining that Rome is not solving the Meletian schism. It's worthless. But your argument was at the beginning, Rome is there to solve schisms and provide unity. And I'm saying I can show you that it's not a tradition, an oral tradition in Basil, because Basil's saying the opposite. And by the way, where's the evidence that so you're saying, well, it's an argument from silence. Well, that doesn't prove anything. So I could just, if you can bring an argument from silence, I can bring the opposite and say, well, you have the opposite view, which is an argument from silence.
Yeah, I wasn't saying argument of complete silence. I was just saying creedal silence. So the fact that it wasn't codified in the Nicene or Nicene-Constantinople Creed. Because I would say Irenaeus' quote about all churches must be subject or in communion with Rome due to her principal unity. I think is that the quote.
But you're leaving out, what's the reason for that in his argumentation?
I don't know. I'm ignorant.
Well, he says because it's the See of Peter and Paul.
Yes.
But if you get to Vatican I, alters that and says you cannot say that the greatness of Rome is due to its double apostolicity. It is only because of Peter. In fact, that's actually rejected and condemned. So if the Vatican is going to prove its position via Vatican I to Irenaeus, why does it reject the very line of argumentation explicitly that Irenaeus uses?
I don't think that would necessarily mean it rejected the argumentation. It's just saying that even though Paul is included in that, he's not the reason for Rome's principal position. But it's a true statement. That
but dude, in Irenaeus, it is the reason. That's his whole line of argument there.
What's the? Do you have the verbatim quote? From
well,
Irenaeus?
Hold on. Before we go to Irenaeus, do you want to look? We're moving away from Constantinople I because, again, you're missing the point that Common has had out of communion with Rome via Meletius, and Rome still, by the way, counts Meletius as a saint, so he died out of communion with Rome. And I'm just trying to say that if Constantinople I, for example, that Chalcedon disputes Canon 28, right? That New Rome is Constantinople and it's second after Old Rome, right?
It disputes that. They say that they don't agree with that statement.
Yes, Pope Leo rejects Canon 28 because it violates the order of Nicaea of Rome, Antioch, and Alexandria. I'm making the point is that why would Constantinople I go ahead and say that we have determined that Constantinople is second after Rome if they did not have the authority to do that outside of being in communion with Rome? And we know that they're doing it against Rome because in Chalcedon, Rome continues to reject the exact same canon, that Constantinople is second after Rome. Do you follow that?
I think I do, but couldn't we just say in the Roman Catholic Church paradigm, could we not just say that that is an encroachment or that was a little too far of power, and then only what was ratified by the Pope is ecumenical?
No, the argument I'm making is that the church at Constantinople I did all of this and dogmatized the official doctrine of the monarchical Trinity out of communion with Rome, didn't care what Rome said, even past the canon that Rome would later take issue with. And if Constantinople I eventually gets accepted by Rome officially many years later. So,
and affirms Canon 28 or 26.
Eventually, after a couple hundred years after Leo and Chalcedon, yes, Rome eventually says, fine, Constantinople is second after Rome. But the point is that then you're admitting that Constantinople I was doing all of this and didn't have the papal mindset. So that's the argument.
No, all right. I guess the only other, what do you make of, what's the Robber Council in the first 400 years that is called as ecumenical, and then is it Leo or I can't remember the Pope at the time, but calls it Robber, and then it's no longer, it's rejected?
Well, it's a Monophysite council, so we don't accept it for many reasons. But for us, the reason there are legalities and formalities that occur in terms of what makes it canonically valid. But I'm saying for us, we're first and foremost going to say that, well, if it teaches bad theology, that's why it's false. But are you saying that the only way to know that it's a robber council is what the Pope says? Because the easy way to refute that is Lateran 649, because that also disproves the papal position in that was the case at Constantinople III, because Lateran 649, I'm not trying to shift away, I'm just showing how this disproves this point.
Yeah,
So Lateran 649 was intended to be an ecumenical council, right? So this was the first time, and we know that Pope Martin intended to make this ecumenical, and he actually wanted to do it without imperial interference. So the Pope says, all right, I'm going to call it a council. I want it to be ecumenical. And you have a statement against monothelitism in 649 by Pope St. Martin. Now, here's the thing. If that was intended by the Pope to be ecumenical and it's full Roman See authority behind it, why does the Roman Catholic Church still to this day not consider it ecumenical when in a few years, a couple decades later, 686, you have Constantinople III, which then looks back and says, we already see that Pope Martin condemned monothelitism. We will now investigate and issue an ecumenical council condemnation of monothelitism.
So you're saying Lateran 649 was initially accepted as ecumenical?
No. I'm saying that that Pope Martin wanted it to be. And I'm saying the very actions of the actual Sixth Ecumenical Council were themselves a proof against papacy, because they should have just said, well, Martin's already settled it. We don't need Constantinople III. Instead, they have Constantinople III and say, we issue now the Ecumenical Council statement.
So Lateran, I'm just writing this down so I can.
That's fine. You can look it up. Lateran 649.
Martin, and he wanted it to be
Correct.
Okay.
It was intended to be, yes. And he wanted it to not have imperial interference. He wanted to say, look, we got to get these emperors out of this, because the emperors call the councils, right? And so it's intended to be the first non-imperial, purely papal patriarchate ecumenical council. But the rest of the church never accepts that, because they actually have Constantinople III in 686, which then looks back and says, we will do our ecumenical council condemnation. In other words, they're not ultimately submitting to the fact that Martin in 649 condemned monothelitism. They said, we won't.
686.
Mm-hmm.
So they look back on Lateran 649 and they feel the need to issue confirmation.
Yeah, they don't. Again, if papalism is true, there's no need for, here's the argument. If papalism is true, there's no need for Constantinople III, because Lateran 649 should have settled the issue. That's the argument.
So the fact that they, Constantinople 366 had to revisit, which doesn't make sense. That your critique is that doesn't make sense within the papal.
It proves they didn't have a papal Vatican I mindset. Yes, that's the argument.
Okay.
Oh, this is great. I appreciate this. I love having a civil Roman Catholic chat. These are great. This is very civil. Appreciate your attitude. Very thankful for that. Now, I did want to mention, because these letters of Basil are very relevant to this dispute, because if you read, for example, it begins with, I think it's letter 66 is the first of this discussion.
I'm sorry, it's letter what?
Letter 6. They're not too long either. You could read these in an hour. So letter 66 of Basil is the first of these letters about these problems that they're having with the Meletian Schism.
Real quick, is this going to get posted? Can I review this? Will this stream get posted? I don't even know if it's a stream or if it's on. I'm just on Twitter.
It'll be up. It'll be on the internet for forever, dude. It's eternal. It's immortalized, right?
I'm gonna stop writing all the stuff down then, because I can just go rewatch it and write it down.
Okay, so in letter 66, which is the first one, Basil writes to Athanasius, and he says, I've been appealing to the bishops of the West. I need your help. We have this schism going on. And then I should pull that one up. This is 69. So let me pull up 66. Then he says, this is interesting language. He speaks of Antioch as the head of the body.
Wait, so that's Basil's verbatim words, or
I'm pulling it up, dude. Just relax.
I'm sorry.
Here we go. He says, Plainly, the discipline of the Church of Antioch depends upon your reverences being able to control some or to reduce others to silence and to restore strength to the church by concord. No one knows better than you do that, like all wise physicians, you ought to begin your treatment to the most vital parts. And what is more vital to the church throughout the world than Antioch? If you let Antioch be restored to harmony, nothing will stand in the way of her supplying as a healthy head the soundness to all of the body. Now, every Roman Catholic would immediately jump on that as a proof of papalism. If we just heal the problems in Antioch, the entire body of the church, this is called honorifics. I'm just giving you an example of the type of language that's very selectively used by Roman Catholics when they speak about the papacy, and they ignore the same honorifics of Antioch or Alexandria, all of which are Petrine sees, by the way. So I'm just pointing out that Basil is complaining to Athanasius, and he's saying we got to fix Antioch, because if we fix Antioch, it's the head of the whole body and everything else will heal, right? He's using rhetorical, exaggerated language, right? Because nobody thinks Antioch is literally the head of the church. So this is the first of this letters of dispute here. Now, the next one is 67. It's very short. I'm going to skip it just because he discusses Meletius. So if you doubt me, we'll pull it up just to show that he's discussing Meletius. It's very short. He says, we ought to be united. The church, he says, is divided in Antioch. And unfortunately, because of the schism, we ought to be united. It ought to be under Meletius. So there he's mentioning the Meletian schism right there. I'm just pointing out that that's the context. I wasn't lying when I was saying that earlier, because I know all the Roman Catholics, he's lying. 68 is a letter directly to Meletius. I don't think there's anything that relevant in it. It's also very short. He's just saying he wants to heal the schism. 69 is again to Athanasius. And here he mentions that he's appealed to Rome. He wants help. Rome has failed. So let me find that quote. That's in letter 69, paragraph 2. Begins with, I should advise that. Let me find that part. I should advise that without anyone knowing anything about it, they should travel hither, attracting as little attention as possible by sea with the object of escaping the enemies of peace. A point that is, let me make sure I got the right point. I might be the wrong area. Sorry. Earlier he had said he appealed to Rome. And by the way, he's writing and appealing to Athanasius. So before you say, was he appealing to Rome? You would appeal to anybody, including Athanasius, including all the bishops. So now he's appealing to Athanasius for help because he's saying Rome is worthless. I forgot to make that point. So let me go back to it seemed, and you'll get the full context. It's difficult to find this from my written version. Here we go. Over here to the online. It seemed to me desirable to send a letter to the Bishop of Rome begging him to examine our condition. And since there are difficulties in the way of representatives being sent from the West to a general synodical decree, to advise him to exercise his own personal authority in the matter of choosing persons to sustain the labors of a journey. Notice he's actually saying, can we get a synodal decree? He's not just saying, give us your divine fiat. He's saying, I want Rome to also be involved in a synodal decree. There are difficulties. So he says, we need firmness and gentleness to correct the unruly here, to be able to speak with proper reserve and appropriateness throughout, thoroughly well acquainted with all that has been effected after Armenium and unto the violent measures adopted there. And then he says, we have to be careful because there's enemies. Then he says, a point also that is insisted upon in these parts is that they should drive away the heresy of Marcellus, a grievous and injurious person opposed to sound faith. For up to this time, all the letters that they write, they are constantly and thoroughly anathematizing the ill Arius and in repudiating him from the churches. But they do not attach any blame to Marcellus. He's talking about Rome failing here, who propounds a heresy, the opposite of Arius, and impiously attacks the very existence of the Godhead, the person of the Godhead, the Word, and so forth. He says, hence, when he had come forth, he had no existence. The books that I have in my possession, which contain his unrighteous writings, are proof. Nevertheless, they nowhere openly condemn him, Rome, and are to this extent culpable, being from the first in ignorance of the truth. Rome, according to Basil, is first in ignorance to the truth. They received this heretic in the communion, and the present state of affairs makes it necessary that attention should be called off. So he's saying that I appealed to Rome, and Rome has completely failed.
Is he not? Would that language not entail that Rome was heretical at that time?
But that's what I'm saying. Basil wouldn't have a problem saying that Rome can fail because he doesn't believe in Vatican I papal supremacy. In fact, he'll go on to say that they're absolutely ignorant of the faith, which how could you say that if they are the only Catholic Apostolic Church? That's the oral tradition that they probably have.
Well, the reason I bring it up is I didn't know that either side, like either Orthodox or any Catholic apologist, I didn't know. This is what Pope who?
I think the next letter is Pope. So he's writing, I think, to Pope Damasus. So let's look at the next letter, which is, I think, to the Pope, and we'll see that it's not papal. So let's look at letter 70.
What I'm saying is I had never heard that Pope Damasus was a heretic. Like
I'm not saying he's a heretic. Basil is saying that he's worthless and ignorant of the truth.
Yeah, I guess I'm critiquing. My point is that seems to be in the same way that.
But it proves that he doesn't believe in the Vatican I mindset. That's all I have to prove.
But in the same way that you would say that there's times where people give honorific language, could that not be but over exaggeration in the fact that he's just pissed with Rome and he's like, they're freaking worthless? The same way I might see a Catholic today say,
but no Roman Catholic can say that if they have, then it just simply proves he doesn't have the Vatican I mindset, because Roman Catholics can't say that Rome doesn't know the truth or that they're ignorant of the gospel. You could say that, but that means that Rome has erred on basic magisterial ordinary teaching, which is not possible according to Vatican I. So that's again just proving that it's not the Vatican I mindset.
But you think that Basil was wrong here? Because you think that
it doesn't matter. Again, it's not the Vatican. All I have to do is prove that it's not the Vatican I mindset. So it really literally doesn't matter whether Basil's wrong or not, because it simply demonstrates that he doesn't have the Vatican I mindset, nor does Constantinople I.
Because as you're saying, as long as he holds the belief, regardless of whether or not it's correct.
All I'm showing is that it's not Vatican I, and that this is counter evidence to your claim that there's an oral belief amongst these people that Rome is the one Holy Catholic Apostolic Church. Because you understand, these are the guys that got one Holy Catholic Apostolic in the Creed and the Holy Spirit part. It's Basil. Basil's a huge part of that, and then Nyssa and Nazianzus. So Constantinople I has the added part of the Creed to the original Nicene Creed. I believe in one Holy Catholic Apostolic Church. I confess one baptism of the remission of sins, right? That's added by these guys. And so that tells me that when I read their writings, they certainly don't believe one Holy Catholic Apostolic Church is essentially and primarily Rome, because they wouldn't be writing and speaking this way about a council held out of communion with Rome.
I see the critique.
Oh, by the way, let me make sure that, because there's in this letter to Damasus, he goes on to say, he says, you failed. I'm really disappointed in you. I'm looking for the exact quote of what he says. I don't think there's nothing really else about, he's just basically saying that the church over here is all messed up, and I was disappointed in your lack of aid.
To Damascus?
To Pope Damasus, yeah.
Oh, sorry, Damasus, not Damascus. Being as charitable as you can to the Roman Catholic position, you don't think that could be like a bishop? I'm thinking of a bishop. I guess the weight of it is he's the person who's articulating one Holy Catholic and Apostolic. He's not just a bishop writing frustration. He's the one articulating.
Yeah, all three of the Cappadocians are really essentially the main theological figures of Constantinople I, and the main figure is Gregory of Nyssa. So there's even an imperial decree that you can't disagree with Nyssa's interpretation and view of what the Niceno-Constantinopolitan Creed says.
Where was that? That's a decree at?
No, it's an imperial decree. It's probably in the Price translations, but it's something that Dr. Bo Branson refers to. So you'd have to ask him what the exact source is on it. I don't have that off the top of my head. That's an argument he makes. It might be in his dissertation. I'm not sure.
But the weight of an empirical decree like that would show. Couldn't an emperor be wrong though? No, that would show that there was that belief.
I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that proves that Nyssa and the Cappadocians are the theological milieu for understanding Constantinople I, but I don't really think anybody I don't even think Roman Catholics would disagree with that are familiar with it.
Does Nyssa have Basil level wording against the Roman See?
No, I'm pointing out Nyssa is specifically stated about the triad, because Constantinople I is the first dogmatized full Trinitarian doctrine, and it's actually the last. up until, for the Orthodox, there's not another Trinitarian statement until Byzantium, until the Palamite synods.
But y'all add to it there?
Well, they don't add to the creed, but that's where you get license energy, dogmatize the Palamite synods. What I'm saying is that for the first 1,000 years of the church, the Trinity is pretty much, it's all the rest of the debates are Christology. Trinity is done at Constantinople I. That becomes the official ecumenical dogmatic statement on what the Trinity is.
Which is lacking in the Son.
It's also none of the later Roman Catholic speculations. In other words, the Latin, the West, for example, goes in the direction of the Augustinian ideas of the triad. And that obviously dominates in the early Middle Ages, and then it gets sort of trumped by the Thomistic ideas of the Trinity. So what I'm saying is that that's already foreign to the Cappadocian model of the Trinity, which is already laid down at the Second Ecumenical Council. And I forget the exact date. I'm going to say it's a few hundred years after. When does Rome... I'm going from memory here, so I could be wrong on the exact date here.
All good. I'm not trying to get you, just trying to learn.
No, I appreciate your attitude. Of course, I don't even know. I don't know if I can trust even the AI that pull this stuff up.
J. Dyer using AI during debate with Roman.
This is what I thought was the case, assuming that this AI is correct, and it's citing the papal encyclical. So I think this is probably true. So hold on. So Constantinople I is gradually accepted in certain ways and areas by Rome over time. So I'm not saying it's true because I'm just giving an example. So one of the reasons that, aside from the Meletian Schism and Meletius being out of communion with Rome, is the question of Canon 3, which says that Rome would, Chalcedon, the EP would be second after Rome. So that was another reason.
Patriarch,
yes.
The EP, okay.
So it's that Rome doesn't like that, on top of the rejection of or being out of communion with Meletius at the time. And then in 451, the same canon is added to Chalcedon. That becomes the famous Canon 28 of Chalcedon, which is Canon 3 of Constantinople I. So it's still rejected, but then Gregory the Great officially accepts the Constantinople I in total in his day. So a lot of it has to do with specifically the canon about Constantinople, but I'm trying to remember exactly, because if it cuts both ways in my view, because if Rome accepts the Constantinople model of the Trinity, then you can't have the Augustinian model of the Trinity, because that's not what's accepted at Constantinople I. So if you argue that Rome disagreed with the canon about Constantinople but accepted the theology of Constantinople I, then that's even more damaging in my view than if you said over time, well, maybe down the road they eventually accept it, but they didn't initially. So I remember Craig wrote something on this. Let me see what he wrote. I don't remember. Gratian claimed that the Apostolic See of Rome has not accepted Canon 3 of Constantinople. I'm interested in the theology, though. That's what, because I know about this canon debate, but I'm more interested in the theology because I remember reading that it was much later. Let me see, but I don't remember off the top of my head when that is. It seems like I remember reading a few centuries after Chalcedon, but that would be Gregory the Great. But that might have just been about the canon. So Rome, interesting. Well, if you think about the creed, they would have accepted the creed. Oh, interesting. So this is according to Encyclopedia Britannica, which could be wrong, but it's claiming that the creed was accepted 70 years later at Chalcedon. So that would mean that Rome was perhaps reticent to go with Constantinople I until 70 years later.
Reticent meaning wanting to?
Yeah, we're hesitant because it took them 70 years to accept the addition to the creed of Nicaea, and then it took until 600 AD to accept the disputed canon about Constantinople. So in other words, it's gradual. That's why this is confusing, is that it's actual gradual acceptance of parts of Constantinople I. That's why.
Is Constantinople I is the last one that the Coptics hold to, right? Don't accept.
No, they accept Ephesus because Ephesus is dominated by St. Cyril.
And then they leave at Chalcedon. They can't agree with us.
They don't accept Chalcedon, right? So they have the first three.
So what, I guess that's my question, is the Trinitarian language there? I know it's about monophysism.
Oh, hold on. You understand that the Orientals actually are an argument in our favor because they don't have filioque. They agree with us on these points. So that shows you that even the schismatics, from our view of that time, have our same Trinitarian theology, and they accept Constantinople one the way we do, and they interpret it the way we do.
I'm just not. My Trinitarian theology is just not good enough to really. I would just be.
Well, but even aside from that, I'm just saying that, do you see that the schismatics and the heretics, from our vantage point, are an argument in our favor, because even the heretics, even the Orientals, affirm our understanding of Constantinople one. Does that make sense, what I'm saying?
Yes.
I'm not saying it's true because they affirm it. I'm saying that they're evidence that even the heretics don't interpret Constantinople one to be filioque or possible.
I see. I don't know if this might be the wrong use of the word circumstantial, but I can see how circumstantial evidence. But
well,
obviously,
circumstantial evidence can be used depending upon the context. I'm not saying it's true because the heretics, we don't care. I'm not saying it's true because they affirm it. I'm saying it's a piece of evidence that, I'm saying, even the heretics don't interpret Constantinople one the way Rome does. They interpret it the way we do, which shows that these ancient groups, even in heresy, still have the same Trinitarian theology that we do.
So
they have a different
Christology with. Okay.
Hey, it's a great chat, man. I really appreciate you being a very civil Catholic dude. That's great. Those are always a lot better than the sort of cheap gotchas and all that.
Yeah, I was a full-blown atheist. Not proud of it, but I didn't even know if religion was real to go.
Mm-hmm.
And then I'm just super fortunate to apostolic Christianity, and it all just makes a lot of sense in ways that I'm just trying to learn always. I came into the Christian faith by just pursuing truth. I literally had no idea if it'd be like Islam.
Sure.
Whatever.
Yeah, well, hey, feel free to call back in anytime. You had a great attitude. It was a great conversation. I am going to have to move on because we're going to be doing the stream with Tristan here in a little bit. And that will be on UFOs and the occult and alien abductions. We'll be doing that in, I think, an hour. Is that right? I'll give you guys this link again. So great conversations tonight. Very civil. This is the best way to do it. Doesn't always happen that way, but that's okay.